Remember, Sidney, no one here can know I am royalty. You must appear to be no different than the average man.
I will not say a word.
Oh! You dumb fuck! Take us to Queens at once.
You sure you guys want to go to Queens? A couple rich fellas like you should be in Manhattan. Stay at the Waldorf or the Palace.
The palace sounds good. Take us there.
No, I want Queens. We're not rich. We're ordinary African students.
Whatever you say, pal. What part of Queens you want?
Take us to the most common part.
That's easy. There's one thing Queens has got a lot of. It's common plots.
What does dumb fuck mean?
That was a scene from the 1988 movie Coming to America, where the prince of some country, fictional country, is wanting to meet his queen. And so he goes to where else? Queens, New York. He says, we're just average African students sitting in the back of a taxi going to Queens. But there are plenty of cues in this shot that tell us that he's not just your average African student. He has gold jewelry, a big fur coat. He's got an entourage, tons and tons of trunks and luggage. There's plenty in this scene to tell us that this isn't your average African student. This is the collision of two different cultures, the meshing of one to the other. And we're going to learn a little bit in this lecture about what happens when two cultures collide and how two cultures could collide and what is culture to begin with. This is lecture 7. We're going to cover culture in this lecture, and then in the next lecture, lecture 8, we're going to be covering socialization. So while those two concepts are kind of clumped together in your textbook, we're going to just separate them out for our lectures today. Well, we had a little bit of a short week last week with demography. We're back into the thick of it this week. Culture is a huge topic, so is socialization. And some sociologists dedicate their entire lives to sub-parts of culture, not just culture itself, just like people dedicate their entire careers to socialization. But right for now, turn to culture only. First, you need to throw away everything that you think you know about culture. Culture is such a big concept in our society. We often use it to refer to the fine things in life, like good cheese, or the symphony, or highbrow things, like a good scotch. We often refer to people who have what we think of as good taste or fancy taste as cultured. Throw that away. That definition is too narrow. Sociologists have a much broader definition. We also think about culture when we think about, say, Native American rituals or African culture. That's included in our definition of culture, but that's not quite culture in a sociological sense. Again, this definition is much too narrow. Culture is so used ubiquitously in our language that it's really unclear to what we're referring. Culture is a little bit like the word or the concept of love. You can read entire volumes over centuries and still have conflicting ideas, differing ideas about what love is. The same is true of culture. There are complicated notions of what culture is and what culture does in our society. Quote, culture is one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in the English language. Williams, 1975. Indeed, culture is very complicated. I often say in this class, or in my grading, in my comments to students, that they should not look up on the internet. Do not Google the word culture. In fact, you shouldn't be Googling any of these sociological concepts like culture or socialization or social institutions, because Philosophers may have a different definition of these words, same as anthropologists or psychologists. Sociologists have very specific meanings behind these loaded words, these everyday words. So if you're not pulling these definitions from our textbook or from these lectures, you're likely leading yourself astray, and that will have consequences for you on the quiz and on the final exam. So make sure that you're looking to this material, not to other material, to define these sociological words like culture. So what is culture? Culture is a characteristic of a group, not of an individual. It can't belong to an individual because culture is formed via interaction. We talked about this last week when we were talking about the social construction of reality. That is, we have to interact to be able to create culture, to reproduce culture, to sustain culture. Culture is also the way that we understand differences between groups and similarities among groups, how we compare one group or one society to another, and how we understand ourselves within a society, within a group. Culture is not natural. Culture is socially constructed. It is not biological. There's nothing about our genetic code that makes us cultural in one way or the other. It's not a biological fact. We learn our culture. We are socialized into our culture. And that's how culture is created and reproduced. It's also produced through social institutions. We'll cover that a little bit at the end of this lecture. Culture is ubiquitous. That means that culture is like water to a fish. That is, culture is to us like water is to a fish. We don't even notice culture until we're confronted with differences of another culture, like, say, encountering chopsticks at an Asian restaurant, or when participants in our own culture break the rules. Culture is just something that we exist in. Culture exists around us. Culture is everywhere, but we don't notice it, and that makes culture ubiquitous. Culture is inescapable. You might think you can run out and hide underneath an underpass or escape to the Alaska bush, but even in these instances, culture will affect you. You'll know that you have to have clothes, and those clothes should probably look a certain way. You'll speak a certain language, and all of that is culture. You cannot escape culture. Culture is also everywhere. It's in the most remote villages. It's in the most remote places. It's in the most populated places. And culture is constantly being produced and reproduced, and it is always changing. Now, you might say that because we have to create culture via interaction, that when our interaction ceases, that culture also ceases. But culture exists separate from us. Remember Durkheim's conceptualization of society sui generis, that society is something greater than just the addition of the parts? Well, that is culture too. Culture exists outside of us, yet we constantly reproduce culture and produce culture. It's important to know that culture is something that is constant and that it's changing. It's not this concrete thing that is just out there. Culture involves three different types, or three different facets that sociologists study. It involves systems of meaning. That is, systems that refer to the way in which we provide meaning to our lives. The symbolic ways that we create and interpret that give us meaning to who we are, our identity, and what we do with our lives. Culture is also a set of common shared values. It helps us to determine what is important, what is meaningful. Through our habits, we typically discover these shared values and practices. Also, culture is a shared form of language. It's communication. We're going to talk about each one of these components individually. But before we go there, I want you to pay attention to how these three components are interconnected. We're going to talk about them individually, but they all function together. First, systems of meaning. These involve symbols. These symbols may communicate an idea, but that idea exists outside of that symbol. For example, stop signs are readily understood as "stop the vehicle here," or a cross is understood more or less as the sign of Christianity across the globe. But here's one that's less obvious. Underwear models are toned and display desirable characteristics. For example, women are often posed in deferential positions that communicate sex. Men, on the other hand, are posed to communicate strength. Aside from the fact that we consider it taboo to go commando, we buy these underwear because of the message we get from the picture in the ad or the picture on the box. For anyone who's ever ventured beyond the Fruit of the Loom 3-pack, you know that wearing underwear does not make you look like the man or the woman in the ad, nor does the woman or the man in the ad come in the box with the underwear. But this is a symbol in our society, the society that we can have this. This value that's on this box is sold to us in these underwear. Symbols come in two different forms: material culture and non-material culture. Material culture are the things that you can touch. You can look at it, you can taste it. Oftentimes, these are a thing. You can think of, say, the American flag. What do you see? A piece of fabric, 3 colors, red, white, and blue, stars. But this piece of material culture communicates an idea to us. Perhaps we think of nationalism. We're proud to be citizens of the United States when we see the flag. It communicates patriotism, those values like voting, running for office, paying our taxes, elements of patriotism. Or simply, it communicates the United States of America. The flag communicates an idea, but nationalism, patriotism, and the United States exist without the flag. That is, they're ideas that can exist separate from the thing itself. But that flag is a symbol of those 3 values, those 3 things, and probably more as well. Those are just the ones that came to my mind. On the other hand, non-material culture is much broader. It refers to what David Newman calls knowledge, beliefs, customs, values, morals, symbols, and so on. Symbols, of course, in this case, are not material. They're not the things that we can touch. For example, we have mothers. If our own mothers were to have never existed, but somehow we still do, the concept or role of mother would not change. The role of mother is a deeply contested idea in modern civilization. For example, whether a mother should work, whether a mother is a nurturer or a provider. But the idea of a mother is cultural, what a mother ought to do. If we lived in, say, a maternalistic society, a matrilineal society, the idea of what a mother should do might change. The men might have more nurturing roles than the women. But in our culture, a patriarchal society, men have roles and women have roles as well. Those are elements of culture. Other things exist as non-material culture as well, like rules or established cultural practices. We have laws. We can't look to a particular symbol for these laws. They're written down in a book, but these laws exist to keep our culture moving. They both constrain us and allow us to cooperate with one another, just like stop signs. Funerals are full of symbols, but the idea of a funeral itself, that ending of celebration of the end of life, is something that is particular to every subculture. It's universally known among most societies. So funerals are established cultural practices. They're non-material culture. When we discuss social class in a couple of weeks, we'll turn to the idea of how culture determines and reproduces social class. Next, we turn to values, beliefs, and practices. That second element, the second component that sociologists study that fall under the umbrella of culture. The values, beliefs, and practices we do impact our social outcomes. The decisions we make are inherently social, and culture explains why we make many of the choices that we do. Values matter. They're important. They're meaningful. So let's just say that you won $1 million. You use your prize money to buy a fancy car because we view fancy cars as a status symbol. You get out of debt. You pay off your credit cards, your student debt, because we view being debt-free as morally superior in society. And you go to the fanciest restaurant in New York because it's a cultural practice that most rich people do. There, you have the interaction of values, beliefs, and practices. But let's just say a nun won $1 million, and she gives it all to charity. Her values might be different than yours, because her values say that we have to give to the needy. Here are two very different outcomes to somebody who won $1 million. And the difference there is what those two people value, what they regularly believe, and what they practice. Values, beliefs, and practices are usually embodied in habits, the habitual things that we do throughout our day. We may not even notice these things. Pierre Bourdieu, we're going to talk a lot about Pierre Bourdieu when we talk about social class, calls these everyday habits habitus. Consider habitus, by the way, is your tastes, preferences, and skills. And habitus, as I said, is invisible, just like culture. We typically don't even notice our own habitus until it's challenged, until we're a fish out of water. Consider your dining room table practices as a child. Did you eat dinner as a family? Did you eat dinner in your bedrooms or in front of a television? Did you sit in a particular place when you were at the table? Did you say a prayer before or maybe even after you ate? Did you have cloth napkins, paper napkins, or no napkins at all? What about the food that you ate? Was it hamburger helper, steak, fish? Was it vegetarian? We didn't think of our own dinner habits as unusual. In fact, it was just eating dinner, right? They weren't odd. But if someone from a different social class, say a very rich person, came to your middle class family and sat down and was served hamburger helper, they might think it disgusting. What if they came from a different country and they saw silverware on your table when they weren't used to having the same kind of silverware? Would they know what to do, what each utensil was used for? What if they came from a different era and they saw that food that was simply boiled and put on the table that would take hours to prepare back in the time that they came from? They would think the whole thing is strange. Our habits build our daily lives. Our habitus is the values, beliefs, and practices, our tastes and preferences and skills of our everyday life. The third component of culture is language or communication. Without language, there would be no culture. Now that's a contested point, but language is absolutely critical, foundational to culture. It's how we communicate with one another. It's how we communicate values. It's how we communicate our habits, the wrongs and the rights, the do's and the don'ts. Without language, we wouldn't be able to tell each other those things. Language, by the way, is not necessarily spoken or written. It can be a series of symbols or practices as well. Any kind of cue that we give one another is language. Language occurs via many mediums, particularly in the modern era. This can be personal interaction. Back in the day, it could have been letter writing. It also occurs through mass media. That includes the TV, internet, newspaper, social media. Language occurs at multiple different levels. Finally, culture universal is a concept that applies to language. If we were to study every society that ever existed across the globe, we would find that a lot of these societies have lots in common. For example, the French and Canadians have some things that are different, but they actually have more that makes them alike than there are differences. But if we were to compare a rare, unconnected Aborigine tribe to, say, Canadians, we would have a lot more differences than we would similarities. But both of these groups use language to communicate to each other in some fashion. And language, as far as we know, is the only culture universal concept, the only thing that we share across every society that's ever existed. Culture has a structure, like a house has a structure. It has walls, it has plumbing, it has wiring. Culture also has a structure. First, there is mainstream culture. Mainstream culture is a widely shared system of meaning and cultural practices in a certain society. You can get a pretty good idea of what mainstream culture is by watching CNN or Fox or any number of American sitcoms on television. Pick up a newspaper and you can get some ideas of mainstream culture. These are the things that we know to be true, things that we just exist alongside of and exist through every single day. Most of us also have or belong to some kind of subculture. Subcultures exist under the umbrella of mainstream culture, but they have additional or modified systems of meaning or cultural practices. That could be a religious group like Catholics, or maybe even a specific church. They could be motorcycle clubs or environmentalists, gun owners, musicians, even entire movements like hippies. These groups didn't necessarily want to upend the things about mainstream culture, but they did have their own set of values and beliefs and systems of meaning that existed alongside or underneath mainstream culture. Finally, there's countercultures. These countercultures actually do attempt to upend the values and systems of meaning in mainstream culture. These groups include neo-Nazi groups, communists, anarchists, people who definitely want different outcomes through different values, who value different things even than the people who live and produce mainstream culture. Comparing cultures is a chief task of sociologists, and we all do it, whether we're sociologists or not. But the way in which we do it can be summarized in two different concepts. The first is ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is when we place our culture hegemonically. Hegemonically means a system or ranking of power, where we place our system or our culture as better than the rest, something that the other cultures ought to aspire to be, or that when those people from other cultures come into our culture should assimilate to. Ethnocentrism says that my way of existing, my values, are better than your values. On the other hand, the exact opposite, in fact, is cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is a perspective that allows us to understand cultural symbols or practices in their own cultural context. It's essential to a sociological imagination to understand or compare other cultures using cultural relativism. Now, some sociologists would say that comparing cultures is ethnocentrism in and of itself. But cultural relativism, in a broad definition, could include comparing cultures. Most importantly, cultural relativism allows us to understand other people's systems of meanings, rituals, values, and language within their own cultural context. To understand what they value, to understand their practices, to understand their language, to understand what they're doing and why that thing that they're doing or ritual that they're doing has meaning. So, for example, look at dogfighting. Most people watching this lecture probably find this practice to be barbaric, to be morally wrong, bad. It's illegal in our country, the United States, to fight two dogs. In fact, it's illegal throughout most parts of the world to pit two dogs against each other. But in some places of the world, it's still cultural practice to engage in dog fights, to train dogs to fight one another. In Japan, Russia, and parts of Eastern Europe, dog fights are still common practice, mostly in rural places there. It's illegal throughout Pakistan, but that's a mere technicality. In rural Pakistan, dogfighting is a common practice, and Pakistanis place large bets, millions of rupees, on winning dogs. These dogfights are like a county fair to us. They're cultural events, social events where people, sometimes hundreds, thousands of people, gather in town centers to watch these dogfights go down. Did they think they're morally reprehensible? Well, obviously not. Otherwise, they'd put an end to it. If we were to go there as sociologists and say, whoa, dogfighting is reprehensible, stop this, cut it out, you can't do this, this is illegal, we are then engaging in ethnocentrism. The idea that our value of dogs as pets, as companions, is better than their value of dogs as these creatures trained, bred in order to fight, to make money. Now that's a little bit of a hard pill to swallow, right? I mean, none of us, hopefully none of us, if we're following our system of beliefs, want to see two dogs fight each other to the death, or even to the point where one dog is extremely maimed. But if we really want to understand why Pakistanis engage in dog fights, we have to at least engage that culture in its own context. We have to engage it on terms of cultural relativism. And that, especially in the case of dog fights, things that we consider morally aberrant, is a very difficult thing to do. Where does culture come from? Culture comes from cultural production. That might seem obvious, but we have to think that culture comes from somewhere. We have to understand that culture just doesn't exist. It's being produced and reproduced constantly in society. Culture is made. So who does that making? Who makes culture? Do we make culture? Does somebody, some external force make culture? And in this production of culture, who gets a voice? Who gets to say what is good and what is bad? What should be continued on and valued and what shouldn't be? Those are all tricky questions. We're going to talk about social institutions next week. They include things like the family, education, religion. But the one that's important to highlight this week is the media. The media has an extremely strong voice in telling us what should become valuable, what's unimportant, or who should get a voice in what's being important. Think about the presidential election of 2016. There technically are four candidates. There's the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein. There's the Libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson, the Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton, and the Republican candidate, Donald Trump. But from a day-to-day basis, we largely only hear about Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. We don't hear about the other two candidates. That's because the media is making an active decision to say who gets a voice, who gets promoted, who is valued, and who is not. That's cultural production. Cultural production can be understood in two different ways. Cultural democracy, or as we'll turn to next, cultural industry. Jürgen Habermas and Herbert Gans, both modern sociological theorists, say that cultural is democratic. They say that we, you, me, and the rest of the public, our peers, determine what culture will be, what culture is. We vote with our time and with our money. Think about films or genres of films that get lots of money at the box office. Batman, anything that major actors or actresses are portrayed in. things like anime, things like far-off topics, low-budget films. They don't get money, they don't get audiences, and we are voting them down by not watching them, by not paying to see them. We enter this public sphere, this place, this democratic place where we have a voice, and we use that voice, say Habermas and Gantz, in a rational way. We can assemble into groups. We choose to get into groups and to fight for specific causes, say pro-choice or anti-abortion. We have a choice whether one of those two things will continue in society. We have access to newspapers to promote our ideas, TVs, television, and the internet, and more importantly now than ever, social media. These are all mediums that, even whether it's true or not, Habermas and Gantz say we have access to these, and therefore our mainstream culture, our popular culture, is user-driven. We have this big marketplace of ideas, entertainment, etc., and we choose to participate, to like some of them, to buy some of these material goods, to use them. And these become popular, and therefore these ideas become popular. Think about the rise of Uber, where anybody can be a cab driver using a car, their own car, and the fall of organized labor. Organized labor representing the taxis. Taxi drivers, by the way, are mostly unionized. Unionized means organized labor. But we're choosing more and more to use ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft, and less to use organized labor. That is taxi cabs, taxi drivers. We're voting with our feet, with our money, with whose cab we choose to ride in. That is popular culture. That's popular culture that is user-driven. If we turn the coin over, the opposite argument, the competing argument, we get Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, the Frankfurt School, as they're better known. They say that culture is not our will. We are not constantly producing culture. We're not determining culture. Rather, we are passive in the production of culture. We simply receive it. We don't have a vote in what culture is produced, what culture is weeded out. They say that culture or entertainment is produced by the elite. It does not challenge the practices or beliefs of the day, and it's aimed, this is key, at making money. It's ultimately advertising, not art. But you, the consumer, are told that it's art. But ultimately, it's just advertising. A wolf in sheep's clothing. Think about your Facebook feed. In 2006, when Facebook was new, there were no advertisements, or at least there were very, very few advertisements, and they were generic. They were advertisements that everybody who used Facebook was seeing. Now, there are advertisements on the side of your screen, in your news feed, and even your friends can use Facebook to sell you stuff. We might think of Facebook as something we control, but ultimately, Horkheimer and Adorno would simply say that we passively take in all that advertisement. Why does Facebook exist? Well, we think that Facebook exists to help us connect to our friends, our family, our peers. Ha! No. Facebook exists to make money. To make money for Mark Zuckerberg and for CEOs and corporate executives and investors in Facebook. Not to keep us in touch with our friends and family and peers. Of course, it does both of those things, which makes this argument a little bit hard to swallow whole. Because, keep in mind that though Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, WeChat, all of these forms of social media have been used to advertise goods, they've also been used to facilitate rebellion, protests, mass protests, entire wars. They even have been used to formulate rebellion, where two people on Twitter said, we should overthrow X. And they didn't think they could until they realized that another person also thought they should overthrow X, and there a movement was born. That would have never happened. So to say that culture is pure industry, that it's pure commodity, is a flawed argument. But cultural democracy is also a flawed argument. Therefore, we land somewhere in the middle, probably, of these competing ideas of why and how culture and by whom culture is produced. Who cares about culture, or defining culture, or understanding culture? Why not just go about our daily lives and do culture, I guess, without even knowing that it's actually culture? Why is it important that sociologists study culture? Why is it important that you understand culture? These are central questions of Howard Becker in the 30 Readings excerpt that you read or will read this week. When you boil it down, there's really one reason. Cooperation. Cooperation, that glue that says I have some social obligation to you, whether it's to stop at a stop sign so I don't run through that stop sign and bash your car and kill you and your family on your way to work, or to not smoke in a restaurant so that you later get get lung cancer later in life, or to go to work and make money, to provide a service to people and in exchange get money for it. That's all forms of social cooperation. And it's that cooperation, that social glue, that allows us to exist side by side and, as Becker says, most importantly, allows us to plan our lives. It makes it possible for us to plan our tomorrow. Without culture, we would constantly be looking for food. We would be mere animals. We would be trying to save one another, save ourselves rather, from each other. Culture is the thing that holds us together, yes, but it's also the thing that makes us different from one another. Culture gives us meaning and it gives us purpose. But how do we know what is wrong and what is right? What is valuable and what is not? How do we know what to do and when to do it? How do we know when we go to our rich in-laws what utensil to pick up at the dinner plate? Or when we go to our Jewish friend's son's bar mitzvah, what do we do? Well, socialization. That's how we know what to do. But we're going to save that topic for our next lecture, Lecture 8. I'll see you later this week.